Facts First presents Daily Health Practices from Colonial America that are just too bizarre to be real. Everyone has a morning routine, and they're usually pretty similar from person to person. Shower, shave if you're a man, hair, makeup, teeth, and well, the list goes on and on. Most morning routines require a great deal of effort and time, but they are essential. Our morning routines today are much different, though, than they were many years ago. Here are some daily health practices from Colonial America that are just too bizarre to be real, but they are real. Bathing. Most people shower every day. If they can't get in the shower every day, they do make sure to shower at least every other day. During the 18th century, people were advised not to bathe daily or even regularly. Doctors back then believed that bathing regularly would remove the body's natural oils that are essential for good health. Cleanliness and godliness. Religion and cleanliness, they went hand in hand in the 18th century. If a person was dirty, they were looked at as sinners. If a person tried to look groomed and well-kept, people believed they were less likely to do anything wrong. In other words, more godly. Infant baths. Men, women, and children would wash their hands and faces in the morning. Only infants were bathed daily. Parents didn't bathe their infants regularly, though, to keep them clean. They did it to harden them. When the infants got older, they'd start washing just their hands and faces daily. MEN-REPELLENT. Many single women chose not to bathe often and used that uncleanliness as a means of self-defense. They believed that if they smelled really bad, it would keep the overly persistent men from hitting on them. Maybe they remained single because the smell repelled even the good guys. Bathtubs. Many people chose not to bathe every day because they didn't have bathtubs large enough to fit in. Only the very wealthy could afford a large tub, and since most people weren't wealthy, they didn't bathe daily. Some people would bathe in fresh bodies of water if the weather permitted, but they rarely brought soap. Speaking of soap, lye soap. The only type of soap available during the 18th century was lye soap. It was made of a mixture of animal fat, ash, and, well, of course, lye. It wasn't used for bathing, though, for a few reasons. First, it was hard to make. Also, it was very harsh on the skin, and because of this, soap was mostly used just for washing clothing and washing dishes. Not all the clothes were washed. Today, washing clothes is a pretty easy process. You put your clothes in the machine, add some detergent, push a button, and boom, your clothes are washed. During the 18th century, though, it was a lot more difficult. Water needed to be drawn and then heated. The clothes would be cleaned, and then wringing them out was pretty difficult. Because washing clothes was so hard, not everything was washed. Most people would only wash their dirtiest clothes, like aprons, underwear, and diapers. A person's everyday clothes were rarely ever washed. Bug infestations. Since clothing was difficult to wash, it was evident that people rarely washed their blankets. That'd take more work than people wanted to do. Because people didn't wash their blankets, it would often lead to frequent bug infestations. People in the 18th century had to deal with fleas, cockroaches, and mosquitoes. Many people couldn't deal with the infestations, so they would resort to sleeping by a campfire. Lice. Lice was a big problem with people in the 18th century, but it wasn't poor people who often got the lice, it was upper middle class. The wealthy would often wear powdered wigs, and although the men and women would shave their heads first, the bugs would nest in the wigs, and it made the perfect place for those little critters to settle. Since poor people couldn't afford expensive wigs, they didn't have to deal with the lice problem. Preventing lice. When people realized that lice were the source of their problems, they took steps to prevent it. Since washing wigs didn't help, they would coat the wigs in bay leaves, bergamot, and other repellents. Because the wealthy would style their wigs, using repellent wouldn't help. It just acted as a magnet for the lice. George Washington. Washington had to deal with vermin and other problems. He'd often write about his experiences and said that soldiers were required to wash their T-shirts every week. They only had to wash their hands and faces daily during wartime. Because the camps were so crowded, it was the perfect breeding ground for critters, parasites, and diseases such as smallpox. Camp followers. It was important that the camps were sanitary and kept in order. The camps had camp followers, who were either women or slaves, and it was their job to make sure that the soldiers' uniforms and undergarments were clean and that their meals were adequately prepared. Shaving. In the 18th century, men didn't shave themselves. Instead, they would go to the barber shop, where a man of color with skill would give them a shave. Women didn't shave at all, which was one of the reasons they didn't show any skin at all. If a woman wanted to remove her hair, it would be plucked. Some 18th century medical journals suggested using creams that were made from limestone and even arsenic. Dental care. People didn't think much about their dental hygiene in the 18th century. If a person had a toothache, they'd use chamomile, alcohol, or opium to dull the pain. If a person needed to have a tooth pulled, they couldn't make an appointment with their dentist. They would visit an apothecary, barber, or even a blacksmith to pull the tooth. For those who were worried about their oral health, there were metal toothpicks available in stores. And that was pretty disgusting because these picks were also used for picking dirt from their nails or scooping wax from their ears. Most people didn't care if their teeth rotted out of their mouths because decayed teeth were a symbol of wealth. In the 18th century, only the wealthy could afford sugar. If a person had rotten teeth, it showed that they were wealthy enough to afford that sugar. Over time, healthy teeth became a priority for everyone. Thank goodness. Dentures. Today, dentures look and work just like real teeth. Back in the 18th century, though, if a person needed dentures, they would have to get them from the dead. Yeah, most of the dentures came from dead soldiers. Later, wooden teeth became popular, and finally modern dentures became available, which was a considerable advancement for dentistry. Using the bathroom. In the 18th century, there was no indoor plumbing. People didn't even have bathrooms in their houses. They would use outhouses that were basically just covered holes in the ground. The wealthy would use chamber pots, and then the contents would be thrown out the window when they were full. These practices were very unsanitary, and they created some serious health conditions. The feces and other contaminants would seep into the groundwater, or it would run into the streams and lakes, and that caused those bodies of water to be contaminated. And that's why diseases such as cholera, typhoid fever, and influenza were so prevalent in the colonies. Dysentery was also widespread. Sharing bathwater. In the 18th century, it took a long time to heat the water for a bath. Because of that, families would share bathwater. The bath order often went from oldest to youngest, which meant that the baby of the family would be forced to wash in the rest of their family's filth. Because heating the water was so time-consuming, families would not bathe daily. Families, in fact, would be lucky if they bathed once a week. Since the wealthy had slaves and servants to heat the water for them, they bathed more frequently than those who were less fortunate. Clothes. We already know people didn't wash their clothes very often in colonial days, but they also didn't own very many clothes either. Most people owned just 4 outfits. They had one for each season. When it was time to wash their clothes, they would have to do so completely naked because they didn't have anything else to put on. Dieting. Women were just as concerned about their weight in the late 19th and early 20th century as they are today. Back then, they didn't know about superfoods, and they didn't have supplements to help lose weight. Doctors would give people with weight issues tapeworms on purpose to help the person lose weight. The woman would ingest the tapeworm and then let it eat up all their food and nutrients. Doctors even advertised tapeworms that were packed in jars. Today, it is well known that tapeworms are extremely dangerous, and if a doctor suspects that you have a tapeworm, they're going to begin treatment to get rid of it immediately. Toilet paper. Toilet paper wasn't around until the 20th century. Before that, people had to come up with other alternatives to wipe after using the bathroom. They'd use things like rags, wet clothes, leaves, sticks, even their hands. Ugh. It was far from sanitary, of course, but they had to work with what they had at the time. Toilet paper was first introduced in Japan. It finally made it to the United States shortly thereafter. And thank goodness for that! Subscribe for more!